Well, I'll be very quick. My remarks are really based on the drafts that we're seeing in the communiqué. Communiqué is not that far from actually emerging, but so I'm assuming these drafts fairly reflect what's happening with possible revision. I would make maybe two or 3 points. One, reading through the declaration, it seems to me, and not surprisingly, that it's a progress report. And many of the aspects that really the commitments that were originally commenced either at Washington or London, and particularly Pittsburgh, still need completion by the time of Seoul or later. So we're still awaiting, particularly on financial regulatory reform, on banking reform, we're still awaiting those changes. I would point, there's a fairly detailed examination of the improvements in the multilateral development banks and identification of the amounts that are now being provided there. So I think that's pretty important. I think from Canada's perspective, I think this is a significant statement, partly because they did obtain, apparently, the hard targets with respect to deficit and debt. Apparently, they will get the 2013 halving deficit, and they will get stabilization or a downward trend in debt by 2016, with the exception of Japan, which has already been which has been noted. Lastly, in talking to some of my colleagues and the researchers at the G8, G20 research group, we are scoring, and hopefully we are scoring where we think the objectives and commitments are. G8, G20, talking to one of them, we kind of collectively said, oh well, we'll give the G8 statement a C. We'll give the G20 statement closer to an A, because the commitments there are and the objectives are quite clear, and they're hopefully something in which we now see compliance as really the objective of Korea.
All right, Alan, thank you very much. Next up, we have Andrew Cooper. He's a distinguished fellow at the Center for International Governance.
Thanks. Thank you. And we should say that CG has been advocating for a G20 back to 2003, but our advocacy doesn't mean that we're not, allowing a lot of sort of looseness of the architecture as we see it. I think a couple of things are clear. One, the G8 has advocated economic core efforts. Obviously, they can do this on the bilateral, but the core lines of economic policy. And certainly the sense that they're really doing all of the other issues besides the economics. The other interesting issue is that they've moved from sort of a diffuse aspect to a much more sort of niche component, much more focused, and of course maternal health has grabbed the attention. Canada, I think, has ponied up in a fairly generous way, 1.1 billion. But I think at the same time you see that the Europeans have not been as generous, and of course this reflects the problems within the G20 as well in terms of deficits. Two sort of additives on that. One, of course, is that the G8 felt the need to go beyond the core G8 countries. So we see Switzerland, Norway, New Zealand, and I think in some ways even more interestingly, sort of a bit of a network twist rather than sort of club G8 going to the Gates Foundation. If you know the maternal health issue, you'll know that at the beginning of June there was a major conference, Women Deliver, and Melinda Gates offered 1.5 billion, and of course this was included, or it seems that it was included as part of the non-G8 component of maternal health. I think what's missing is some of the other issues that could have been given more attention. If you look at the outreach countries, you see that Colombia, Haiti, Jamaica were included, and even though there's sort of some notice of attention on terrorism and international crime, certainly no big initiative on that front. So again, I think maybe a missed opportunity. On the G20 side, as Alan alluded to, I think we're seeing the end of sort of lifeboat ethos here. Going back to November 2008, I think the big focus was sort of this
near-death experience. It was a great deal of coordination. We saw it through Washington, D.C. In November, in April in London, in Pittsburgh in September 2009. I think that has loosened considerably. We've seen going back to the national level now. We've seen sort of an allowance for national perspectives. Certainly no bank tax, certainly no sort of hard, firm criteria for deficit debt fighting. And as Alan again has noted, certainly lots of exceptions, notably Japan. Constituencies, I think, are also interesting. If you look back at the G8, you'll know that the G8 has always had a close tie, a complex tie with the NGO community. I think what we're beginning to see is a similar sort of constituency within the G20, the G20 Business Forum, I think is a good example. And I think this is going to be ratcheted up. I think we're in transition stage here, and I think Korea is really going to move to a different level. I think they'll try to widen the agenda, put development on. Certainly, I think have a much more high-profile business segment. But I think even though that is the transition, we're still sort of a bit of a hedging opportunity. And indeed, we even see the jockeying, the slight confusion about who is hosting what. President Sarkozy has obviously put Nice out as the G8, but presumably there will also be a G20 in November. So again, we're sort of at a transition stage. We're certainly going through an interesting process. But again, some of this sort of focus and coordination that we saw through the earlier G20 summits are not available now. Thanks.
All right, Andy, thank you very much for that. And finally, my colleague David Shorr from the Stanley Foundation, our global governance expert and program officer as well. David.
Thanks. I want to pick up on a few things that my colleagues have said. When Alan talked about how the G8 is sort of giving over the economic agenda to the G20, I just want to highlight that the division of labor here seems to me is based on a contradiction. I think it's a contradiction to say that for the global economy's sake, you need the rising powers together with the established powers all around the same table. But then on the other hand, with other global agenda items in the areas of political and security matters, the G8 is going to stay together. And while I think that is short-term politically sustainable, and I don't think this is the last meeting of the G8, I think that the last meeting of the G8 may indeed be in the medium term, because as I say, I think it's an unnatural division. So that's one point. Then I would also say that there were some interesting decisions or agenda items in the security area. Funnily enough, one of the casualties of all of the concern about government spending was an initiative on non-proliferation, on nuclear security. The G8 is the sponsor of something called the Global Partnership Against WMD, which was launched in 2002 at the Kananaskis Summit, and was meant to be a 10-year initiative. It has 2 years left, and there was supposed to be a discussion of renewing it, infusing it with further funds, giving it a clear mandate to expand out from the traditional focus on Russia and the Ukraine. What this does, this global partnership actually pays the costs of dismantling nuclear weapons in the old Soviet arsenal, pays the costs of security measures in some facilities. And because government spending was a little more sensitive at this summit, they did not go ahead and give that forward-going mandate. That doesn't mean that it's going to die, but it does mean that there wasn't that kind of confidence and commitment. I thought it was very interesting to see the Security Council reform issue come up. I think that looks like a very serious initiative. It's a very difficult one, but it's one that certainly the Western powers know. They know what they're getting into. And so it's also the kind of thing that classically you used to think
Well, to drive that through, you're going to need a strong American commitment and leadership. I don't think the U.S. really has an appetite for it, so it will be interesting to see if the kind of condominium of the West can push Security Council reform through. I noted that Andy said that the discussions seem to have an allowance for the national level decisions and an allowance for the national political sensitivities, which is certainly true, but I also I think that can be a glass half full. That if the drive towards full coordination can be difficult, and can be kind of a bridge too far, these pressures I think will nonetheless give impulse in the right direction. Right? I think the fact that China made the announcement of the revaluation of the currency should be taken as a sign, even though they don't want to portray it this way in the communique, but it's a sign that the balanced growth agenda is one that was generating real pressure for action, including by Beijing. And so, as I say, I think there is a glass half full side to the allowing room at the national level.
All right, David, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. We have time for questions. Anyone? Yes, please. Please tell us your organization.
In terms of national perspectives, but also how there can be coordination, particularly from the Europeans. And I mean, it comes to, I have to say, one of my sort of hobby horses on the G20 is that Europe is, at least if not over-representative, has ample representation within the G20. And indeed, this has been a symptom right from the start, right from Washington, D.C., where that Spain, Netherlands, got in, and of course the presidency as well as the commission. What it doesn't seem to have done is give coordination to the Europeans. And indeed, there seems to be sort of a disconnect between the number of European partners within that project and, in a sense, the difficulties. Obviously, within little trios, duos of countries, you are seeing some loose coordination. Bank-tax is probably a good example. But it doesn't seem to have been coordinated at the center. And I think this seems to be a problem. And of course it opens up problems of legitimacy for other regions as well. Again, getting away from the question a little bit, you see sort of the need to have Malawi, Ethiopia, Vietnam as sort of regional representatives. So again, even though it's half full, half empty, it sort of inflates the number of actors within the G20. It sort of moves away from that sort of sense of a hub component. I think the G20 really works well when there's a relatively small amount of actors, when there is a sense of sort of the old era of 1975 meeting the new era of the 21st century. And I think if you water that down, you're going to get into different problems. In some ways, it's the same as the IFI reform, but this is very central to the G20, both the strengths and the weaknesses.
Anyone else? Yes.
Robert, I work for French Building. I'm surprised that none of these that are related for nothing. When we're going to look back, there's really nothing striking at all economic discipline. And as you said, food is much more important. I know you disagree, but I really would like you to tell me why. Because we just accepted what the European countries have decided for their own budgets and reduction. So we just accepted what everyone else decided already. There's really nothing.
Well, I don't think that's really the case. I think, particularly again, the proposal by Canada to have specific targets on deficit and debt reduction is a step forward, notwithstanding that they. No, but they hadn't agreed on these kinds of targets. There are differences. Japan has a very different target, and they recognize that. the particular difficulties with Japan, meaning that its debt is so large there is no prospect of it being able to meet the target of 2016. It's interesting here that the United States, for instance, at least in principle, has signed on to these targets. I think that is a change, and the fact that we have these targets is a change. So that's why I think, assuming that these targets are still there and the final isn't out, so I hesitate only in that sense. But assuming that these targets are in, and I have to believe it's likely because the Prime Minister talked about it in his opening remarks, then I think that is a step forward. I will agree with you that there is a lot of emphasis, particularly around the G20 table, in suggesting that you have to tailor it to each country's needs. But I think that's recognizing a certain practical initiative, and there's a practical aspect to the way in which you're going to coordinate, and they continue to encourage this coordination. So, I do think that they have moved forward. I admit, and as I assessed it before, this is a progress report in a lot of the different critical areas, including the peer review, our independent assessment process, mutual assessment process. That much of that and the reports coming from the Financial Stability Board and the Basel Committee and so forth aren't likely to appear to Korea. And in that sense, I agree. But we did know that. We knew that those were not going to be available here in Toronto.
If I can chip in, what we don't have is that sense of drama from the first three. And also the sense of sort of trade-offs. Some, in terms of, even in the Pittsburgh, the implicit deal between the Chinese and the U.S. about IFI reform or getting imbalances on the we don't see anything like this now.
Right.
I mean, and I think this is a question of whether we're in transition to a different sort of crowd when, again, the Koreans pick it up. They want to have a very different agenda, wide agenda, development, bringing in structural questions, bringing in human capital, bringing in green technology, and so on. And that's the big question, I think, is whether we're sort of at the end of the beginning or, sort of moving on to, in a very good way.
Yes.
And where are you from?
Jordan Malava from that time. I'd like to have your assessment of how Canada fared in this meeting compared to the agenda and the result we share with you.
Well, you have to look at both, obviously, we were presidency of the G8 as well as co-host, although you kind of wouldn't know it, host of the G20. And I think it's fair to say, with respect to the G8, it's some progress, but it has to be a disappointment to Canadian officials with the actual amounts provided with respect to maternal and child health care. They get kind of, covered up or however you want to describe it, but I think the actual numbers in terms of the contribution, I think they have to take as a setback. It's not what they would have wanted to achieve on the G20. Again, assuming that those numbers are in, then I would say that is really kind of moving forward for Canada in terms of identifying physical consolidation as the way in which they're beginning to move, and the fact, again, assuming that these drafts are right, that the bank taxes out of here would again be seen by Canada in their own way as a significant advance.
We've been better on the defensive side, right?
Yeah.
We've been better at sort of having the full court approach to making sure that bank tax isn't implemented. At the same time, on the sort of more offensive diplomatic approach, I'd say certainly mixed results. I mean, we've ended up a certain amount of money ourselves. We haven't had that sort of diplomatic success of getting other, at least the core G8 countries, maternal health is a good example. And given that that's the signature tune for the G8, I think it's a pretty uneven result.
So quickly, thanks for having with us.
Maybe a question over here.
for the G20, now you have your targets, you have your agreements. But say but what if countries don't reach that targets? You don't have a discipline mechanism signing up there. Or say like the WTO, will you really experts believe that in this year that will conclude.
Sure.
And then if the G20 keeps eating up its own promises, then what's the legitimacy of itself?
Well, I mean, clearly that will reflect going forward, but it's important to have that as a basis that others can look at the question of compliance. I think that, you know, in having this, then you, independent third parties, can say, well, you know, at Korea, or that may be too short, but certainly in France, and now in Mexico in 2012, you're not achieving those targets. And so countries can be held to the failure of achieving the reduction in deficit and debt. And I think that is a positive thing, even if you don't have sanctioning. And, you know, sanctioning is pretty unusual in the international system.
In Pittsburgh, they decided not to go the peer review way, right? They went mutual assessment. So, you know, certainly a softer version. And of course, this is one of the differences. I mean, WTO, I mean, is not seen as perhaps the most credible organization at the moment, at least in terms of Doha rep, but at least in terms of having that type of review process. Yes, this is one minute ago.
Anybody else? Yes.
The other shoe from the Andrew Point from the Plains magazine. The other shoe from the not having the bank tax was the language on abolishing too big to fail accountability mechanism.
Right, credible
commitment.
Sorry?
How credible did you think that commitment was? For the language, did you find the language?
Well, the language, you know, I mean, it's aspirational at this point. There's no identifiable policy there. There's simply an enunciation of that. And it would seem to me that clearly individual countries in Europe are already taking it up. I mean, the emergency budget in England is already, or in the UK, sorry, has already identified that, you know, in the fact that they do have a bank levy, right? And so and they've said that the Germans and the French will also do a bank levy, you know, but it is fair to say that we got to look towards individual countries. The American situation is different, because the Americans, again, is a retrospective look. What President Obama talked about in his Saturday internet message, right, the radio message, was a bank tax, but a bank tax to, in effect, fund back the American taxpayer for having paid out so much money under target. So they're not, at least at the moment, they're not looking for it. It's not in the financial regulatory reform either. That they haven't put it into these new, the now reconciled legislation, which has to be still voted on in Congress. So it does vary.
But it perhaps should be said that there's a lot in the financial regulatory reform as well, whatever it's not. There, you know, it's quite serious about some of the sorts of systemic risk. And you know, and I think it is coming both sooner and stronger than would have been expected even a few months ago. You know, the investigation of Goldman Sachs was kind of fortuitous in terms of spurring it on.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
Yes, David Shorr said that, at least this is what I understood, that the G8 is going very soon to be irrelevant, or maybe sometime soon. I wanted to hear both of you on that aspect. And did this summit help in its survival? This is what the Premier has said, I think. Whatever.
Well, in what organization?
I think it's fair to say that our friend, that there was a discussion around these hard targets in the G8, because that's really what came through in the G20 statement. So in that sense, you know, it was the leaders talking about this particular issue there, conveying it into the G20. And I suspect you'll potentially see more of that. I mean, one could certainly contemplate within the medium term that the G8 would not have, a presidency would not have an independent agenda and an annual meeting, but would be meeting at the time of the G20. So that, you know, that they could still be meeting. They could still be holding separate dinner where the G8 members would discuss exactly what they're most concerned about.
And let me just add also, that also, Alan, include the ministerial process. I mean, you can still see ministerial level meetings of the G8, even if it's not
G7.
Well, the G7 on the finance, although that is a highly credible institution, by the way, the G7 finance ministers, and they do meet frequently.
I think you can link the two questions together. I mean, the previous question, because I mean, I think the more the technical questions have dominated the G20, the more life there has been in the G8. And I think you've seen it from two countries, particularly the United States. Pittsburgh, I certainly got the impression that the Obama administration wanted to rationalize the process. They wanted, in a sense, Obama to go to only select summits. And I think that has, again, been watered down since. I mean, I think they're taking the best. Also France. You know, I mean, 2 years ago, it was maybe not the G20, but it was the G13, the G14, the G5, the Highland Down process, plus Egypt, you know, pick your country. Now I think it's different. And from the other side, I think it's because the rising powers have been on the sidelines of many of those technical questions. If you look at who's really debating about bank taxes and capital ratios and so on, it's not China, it's not Brazil. They don't sort of have a dog in that fight, at least at the moment. I mean, so I think unless you get that sort of emergence of sort of the two sides, that they want to have rationalization from the old to the G8, and you have an agenda for the G20 that the emerging, rising, whatever you're going to call them, have a big stake in, and want to have a voice and a real say in the details. And I think we're going to see a different.
My name is Shorr. I understand that this G20 admits their diversity view on the different views and the deficit, even they agree target to deficit. But I think the solidarity or unity we saw last previous 3 summits fading. So do you think under such circumstances, do you think G20 can really work to prevent next crisis or to diagnose next source of this crisis without just
Well, in a way, I mean, the crisis seems to make them work better, not the other way around, right? So if they were to have another crisis, I suspect you'd see them jump to attention on some of these issues. I think, in fact, because we are coming out of that severe crisis, we are in recovery in different phases and different schema, that you're beginning to see this diversity that you didn't see in Pittsburgh and you didn't see in London. So I think it's a product of the fact that the crisis is fading, and therefore it is more difficult to achieve kind of consensus and collaboration.
And the psychology, I mean, in November 2008 was a psychology of collective action. There's uncertainty that you had to hang together. I think now there's sort of shoals in the water everywhere, but there's still some uncertainty, but there's not that sense of collective engagement that you found in 1890.
And the discussion that we're having right here is reflective of, where is the proper place to set expectations? I mean, diplomacy at this level is like any other political process, right? It's an expectations game. And referring back to earlier parts of this discussion, do we really think that that action on global economic imbalances, is going to come decisively, one meeting, fully articulated agreement, with action plans from all directions? I'm not sure that's really the right way to assess what Alan was referring to as a work in progress.
Right. Yes. Where are you from?
CBC Evan Solomon. I missed the beginning. Sorry if I'm going over old ground. Sorry about this. Just in terms of the bank reforms, the kind of the 4 pillars. Is there a characterization that the regulatory framework, the effective supervision, the resolution about the systematic institutions, like sort of the key pillars in the transparent international assessment of period? Did they actually get any real consensus on all of those, or did they punt everything over to Seoul and Basel III on that stuff? So in other words, it's really a wash here, but a stepping stone, as there's nothing binding. So was that a fair assessment?
There's nothing binding part of it.
Nothing binding, and it's also, you have to see the G20 as a network, right? I mean, they do punt, I mean, not only to Basel III, but to the Financial Stability Board, you know, and that is one of the big sort of interesting aspects of this, is that these sort of technical bodies that most people don't even know where they are, who runs them, actually have, you know, the ball punted to them and have to come up, you know, whether it's for this meeting, for November. So the Koreans are there, but I think a lot of the technical issues are still not in the hands of the Koreans.
So that means that in terms of banking reform, and we know what's happening in light of the states, there's going to be some declaration of victory in terms of targets, which are also non-binding, so which is great. But so I'm just. Did he lose then on bank reform as a punt, or is this just part of the process that you got to sort of, the pig has to go through the python on this stuff?
No, I don't think it's a loss. I think most of us understood, particularly because there had to be preparation of the reports by the Financial Stability Board, by the Basel Committee and so forth, that many of these reports were not going to be available for consideration until Seoul in November. So I don't think the Canadians would view the fact that some of these reports have not emerged, right? Particularly around things like quality of capital, capital ratios, leverage ratios. We were aware that many of those reports would not be available to leaders until Seoul. So in that sense, it's not a surprise.
Okay, go ahead. So from I just say from a political point of view, I mean, there's a financial analysis, but from a political / tactical point of view, how does Harper kind of characterize that, knowing that's a process issue, and he could have done other things like, I don't know, for example, not a controversial thing, ending subsidies to fossil fuels, one that has been pushed out there as a real reform you can get done. How do you balance those two politically versus tactically?
But I don't think the fossil fuel subsidy was any different. They are still preparing the country reports. And so you do have, again, as Andy has said, the technical aspects simply need to be undertaken and done, and sometimes it's simply a timing issue. And that's why I think, assuming that those numbers, those hard numbers, are in on deficit and debt, that's what Prime Minister Harper's going to talk about, because he can say, here's what we've achieved. He's not going to talk about, you know, the reports of the FSB, the IMF, the Basel Committee, and so forth, which he knew weren't really given. His officials were telling him that it wasn't going to come. So it's a little bit of, you know, bait and switch here.
And the contrast between the G8, that he wants to have the splashier things, right, with the G20, that he's quite happy to have sort of on the details, technical, you know, and not widen it, you know, in the way the Koreans want to widen it in November.
Oh, absolutely.
Fred Kuntz of CT, we've heard the assessment of how Harper's doing. I'd be interested in hearing David Shorr's assessment of how the Americans are doing, given their concerns about restraint, going too quickly on slowing down the stimulus spending, and also their concerns about multilateral regulation of financial systems. How's Barack doing with his agenda?
I think he's probably happy with all the declaratory statements that prioritize recovery, growth, and jobs. You know, once again, you know, we're in a process, we're in a work in progress, and you know, the proof of the pudding will be in drawing forth whatever stimulus is still needed, and but not being too fast with austerity to jump off the recovery. But in terms of where the stress was laid, I think he probably should be quite happy.
That's what I thought too. It looked more like Obama than Harper in that communication.
And I would say, Fred, that he also, you know, getting some of those statements about countries who have current account surpluses, unnamed, but everybody knows, it's the Germans and it's the Chinese. I think Barack would be quite happy about that, because he's said several times, you know, talked about that distinction, and you know, it's important for the United States on domestic consumption.
Now let's grow the we need it.
All right, time for one or two more questions. Yes. You're from?
Two questions. Why do you think Harper has been pushing so hard to keep the agendas of the two summits really separate and not overlap? And two, do you think we have missed an opportunity with the G20 because we didn't try to widen the agenda, considering that South Korea was development?
Well, I guess from a a very big foreign policy perspective, the question of dilution is there, right? I mean, sometimes you perceive it's better to be in the smaller group. You're going to host in a fairly rapid succession. G20, we're not going to see another G20 hosting in Canada for a long time. And I think it's only when you have a country like Korea that pushes the wider issues, we'll discover whether that is. It took the G8 a long time to move those sort of core economic issues to dealing with security, dealing with one would have thought back in 1975, the policy, So again, what seems to be the case is an appetite outside of Canada for that widening approach. It's very interesting.
It's also a value of diversity, right? I mean, if we're seeing countries now, they're going to host these meetings that are outside of the G8, and they're going to do things in different ways. We're going to have different things they bring to the agenda, and we're going to have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Korea will be the first that have gone to Anglo-American.
And we know that Mexico is now tapped to 12, and that too is an extension into the more diverse, wider leadership. So,
just a life question, why do you think we've been pushing so hard?
You mean why are the Canadians pushing so hard? Because they continue to see the value in their particular influence within the G8, and because there are issues there that they think are important, obviously the ones you mentioned, but also peace and security. That there's no appetite yet in the G20 for those issues, and so you've got to find a place, and the place for the moment is the G8.
You keep hearing hard is tough, right? Big is tough. And it's true. And also, I mean, for all of the unlike-mindedness of the G8, it's still so cozy in many ways. You can still do things on the side. People will do informal meetings. And G20, it's a little bit more staged. It's a little bit more sort of formal in the approach. And of course, again, one will have to wait and see whether it changes or whether it stays like that with that memory.
And Harper certainly talked yesterday about his appreciation of the common purpose, the like-mindedness of that group. It's unlikely he's going to be sticking that today, so we'll see.
Good. Have another question over here.
Just talking about development, you don't have an African number in G8, you have only one African number in G8, less than 20. So when you decide how can they develop, how can they, not participating, but let the others decide their place, although they are observers or something.
Well, I guess the answer is it's not necessarily that they're deciding their fate. They're deciding the fate of the G20, and that includes obviously South Africa as part of that group, which has 85% of the global economy under its wing. So that's what they're deciding.
Not deciding their fate, but still, the way to help them to say what citizens, but they're not on the table.
They're not there.
All right, anybody else? All right, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you. And everybody will be available for questions afterwards if you'd like to speak with anybody on this panel.